What if you could take a life and never even know you did it? Two different men, two different nights, two families torn apart forever by something neither man could remember doing. Both of them claimed the same unlikely defence. They had taken a life while they were asleep. On July 25th, 2008, a camper van pulled into a quiet spot near Aberporth on the Welsh coast. Inside were Brian and Christine Thomas, childhood sweethearts who had been married for nearly 40 years. It was meant to be a peaceful vacation, a time to heal after Christine's recent Parkinson's diagnosis, and after months of Brian battling the depression and anxiety this diagnosis had brought him. But before sunrise, their getaway would end in tragedy. Sometime after midnight, Brian began having a nightmare. But when Brian had nightmares, things were different and dangerous. For decades, he had lived with parasomnia, a sleep disorder that can cause violent sleepwalking and night terrors, often leaving the person with no memory of their actions once they wake up. In rare cases, people with parasomnia have driven cars, attacked loved ones, and even taken a life, all while completely asleep. Unfortunately, Brian was about to become one of these rare cases. This nightmare felt terrifyingly real. In it, Brian saw intruders breaking into their camper van and attacking Christine. On top of her, he could see a man wearing jeans and a black fleece, pinning her down. Only Brian could save her. He leapt onto the figure, pinned him onto the bed, and wrapped his hands around his throat, holding him with all his strength. But in the real world, this wasn't an intruder under Brian's hands. It was Christine. Brian jolted awake to be faced with the devastation he'd caused in his sleep. Beside him on the bed, Christine lay still, unresponsive. He trembled as he grabbed his phone, his voice shaking as he told the emergency operator, "I thought someone had broken in. I think I've killed my wife." When officers arrived, they found him sobbing over her body. In custody, doctors shared his medical records that detailed decades of sleep disorders, violent night terrors, and unconscious behaviour. He was also placed into a specialist sleep lab for monitoring. There, he was observed displaying the same night terrors associated with parasomnia. By the time the case reached court in November 2009, even prosecutors agreed. Brian Thomas had been asleep. He hadn't chosen to kill. The jury was instructed to return a verdict of not guilty. The judge told him, "You are a decent man and a devoted husband. In the eyes of the law, you bear no responsibility." Brian left court a free man, but the freedom was not a relief. He had lost the woman he loved most in the world. Christine's daughter stood beside him. "He loved our mum. He would never have hurt her awake." In private, Brian whispered that Christine still came to him in dreams. "In them," he said softly, "she forgives me." Almost 20 years earlier, and an ocean away, another man awoke to a nightmare he couldn't remember. On May 24th, 1987, 23-year-old Kenneth Parks got into his car in the middle of the night. He drove over 20 kilometres across Toronto to the home of his in-laws. When he arrived, he took a tyre iron from his car's trunk, broke into their house, and attacked. His father-in-law was beaten and left unconscious. His mother-in-law was strangled and stabbed. Moments later, Kenneth walked into a police station covered in blood. He placed the tyre iron on the counter and said, "I think I've killed some people. I don't know what happened." Kenneth had been asleep the whole time. To understand what happened, we need to look at Kenneth Parks' life before that day. On the surface, he seemed like the perfect family man, devoted to his wife and their 5-month-old daughter. But beneath the surface, his world was collapsing. Parks had a severe gambling addiction and was thousands of dollars in debt. To fund his habit, he'd embezzled money from his employer, been caught, and was now facing criminal charges. That weekend, he planned to confess everything to his in-laws, the debts, the charges, and ask for their help and support. On the night of May 23rd, he'd made arrangements to visit them early the next morning to finally tell the truth. But that conversation would never happen. Instead, in the early hours of May 24th, Kenneth made the journey to his in-laws whilst he was still asleep. In the early hours of May 24th, Kenneth suddenly got out of bed, waking his wife in the process. She tried speaking to him, but he didn't respond. She later recalled that although his eyes were open, he didn't seem like he was really there. Concerned, she followed him through the house, trying to get his attention, but he completely ignored her. Without getting dressed or even putting on his shoes, Kenneth walked out the front door, climbed into his car, started the engine, and drove away into the night. And like Brian from our previous story, Kenneth was in a state of parasomnia. In this condition, he drove more than 20 kilometres to his in-laws' home without even being conscious of it. And what happened next was horrifying. Still asleep, Kenneth pulled into the in-laws' driveway, retrieved a tyre iron from his car's trunk, and made his way into their home. He first attacked his father-in-law, Dennis, striking him with the tyre iron and leaving him unconscious on the floor. Before heading upstairs, Kenneth stepped into the kitchen and picked up a knife. Upstairs, in the bedroom, his mother-in-law Barbara was still asleep. Kenneth walked over to the bed and overpowered her before using the knife. When the attack was over, he left the house and, still in a sleepwalking state, drove straight to a police station. Dennis survived the attack. Barbara would not survive. At trial, the defence argued something almost unheard of. Kenneth Parks was innocent because he had never woken up. He had acted entirely in his sleep. Neurologists and sleep experts examined him. Brain scans showed patterns consistent with severe parasomnia, and multiple doctors agreed he could perform complex, even violent actions while completely unconscious. The prosecution insisted it was impossible. They argued the drive alone proved intent, portraying Kenneth as a man desperate to cover his own crimes and debt. But the evidence didn't point to a man trying to cover his tracks. His fingerprints were everywhere. He never hid the weapon, and he had driven himself to the police. More importantly, he had no motive. He had always had a strong relationship with his in-laws, and they would have done their best to help him through his gambling problems. On May 25, 1988, the jury delivered a rare verdict: not guilty. They ruled Kenneth was in a state of non-insane automatism. His actions were involuntary, the product of a sleeping brain. The case became one of Canada's most famous, setting a precedent for sleepwalking as a legal defence in court. Afterward, Kenneth sought treatment for his sleep disorder and addiction. Nearly 20 years later, he appeared in the news again, but this time not for violence. Instead, he was running for public office as a school trustee in Durham. Who do you think was right in this case? The defence for saying Kenneth wasn't responsible for his actions, or even the prosecution, who argued the drive to his in-laws did show intent? Share your thoughts in the comments. Brian Thomas, Kenneth Parks, two men who woke up in a nightmare. Two courts forced to answer this same question. If you take a life while your body moves, but your mind is asleep, are you guilty? The law says no, but for the victims, for the survivors, and for the men themselves, the answer is much harder to live with. Thank you for watching today's video, and if you want to explore more cases like this, consider subscribing. I cover a new true crime story every week. Until then.